September is a month of change in the kitchen garden. Lowering temperatures at night and shortening days will slow down the growth, and it will become obvious that many plants have run their course. There's lots to do this month. Hi everyone, I'm Allie, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that I do here in my garden and on my homestead during the month of September. One of the things that I like to do this time of year is go through the garden and just assess the vegetable plants to see whether they're worth keeping or not. If they're not producing, it's not worth using that space when I can use that space for planting cover crops or another fall crop, like these tomatoes here. They did really good early on, and then when July hit, we had some really hot weeks, 110, 114 degrees, and tomatoes really don't like that. That just causes them to drop their blossoms and it stresses them out. So at this point where I don't have much in the way of blossoms on the top, and I definitely don't have any tomato set, what I'm going to do is come through here and cut the tops off. This is called topping them. And so this is going to push all of that energy down into the existing smaller tomatoes that I got here to help them plump up and also help ripen the ones that are kind of turning red. And that way I'll get a good harvest before we have our first frost. And some of the other tomato plants that don't have hardly any blossoms at all and no fruit on them, then I'm going to just go ahead and remove these entirely. That way it'll open up light for the other crops that are around them. You always have a plant or two in the garden that doesn't do so well. And this cucumber plant right here didn't do very good this year. It didn't produce hardly anything. It was always anemic, but my guess is it didn't get the water or the fertilizer that it needed. Unlike this section right here of the cucumbers, they have been absolutely flourishing. There's still lots of blossoms on them, there's lots of cucumbers, and I'm really happy with it. But I want to keep the production going really good with this. And so I'll feed a liquid fertilizer right into the soil line of these cucumbers to keep them going all the way up to our frost. Even though the temperatures are getting cooler, we still want to watch out for the cabbage loopers. This is the white butterfly that flies around in your garden. It'll lay its eggs, and then you'll get the caterpillar that can devastate your brassica crops. So you want to just keep an eye out for it. If you start to see munching on these crops, then you want to look on the underneath side of your leaves, like this one here. You can see that these guys have been eaten. And right here is that cabbage looper caterpillar. You can hand pick these guys off, or you can spray it with a BT or a spinosad if you can't find them, and it works really well. September's a great time to be planting strawberries in most areas. You may not get that many strawberries, but the nice thing about it is they're having time to establish their root system. So come springtime, they're established, they take off, flourish, and you get a lot more strawberries than you would if you were to plant them in the springtime. Keep continuing to harvest your crops, especially your green beans, your cucumbers, and your summer squash. You don't want them to over-mature. When they over-mature, that just sends a message to the plant to stop producing more flower, which gives you more vegetable. So then that plant puts all of its energy into that over-mature fruit so that it can produce seed. But on the other hand, there are some crops that we are growing for the seed of them, like dry beans. So we want these to fully mature and over mature and actually dry right on the bush themselves. So these guys right here aren't quite close, but they should be ready before we have a hard freeze. This is the time of year that I start checking on my sweet potatoes to see if they're ready. Usually around here they're ready between September and October, and I always want to harvest them before we have our first frost, because if you have a frost on your sweet potatoes it can damage them. So I'll come in here and I'll kind of move the vines around and look where I planted them to see if the potatoes are starting to emerge up out of the soil, and if they are, then I kind of whisk the dirt away and see if they actually are big enough to harvest, and if they are, then I go ahead and harvest some, because you don't want them to over ripen and get too big, because then they start to split. So I'll just check these guys throughout the month, and when they're ready I'll get them harvested. When I first started this garden here, this was nothing but a big weed patch, solid weeds. I had everything from common morning glory to thistles to lots and lots of crabgrass. And it was really hard and almost discouraging to try to control that. Now over the years that I've removed these weed seeds, it's lessened. So this time of year, it's a really good idea to make sure that you stay on top of your weeds and remove any weeds, even if it's just the seed heads. Like this spurge right here. This little guy, if it's just 2 little leaflets, he can produce some seed. So you can see why it's really important to get those weeds under control now so it's less work later. I kind of like this little spot right here. It's a bit crazy, but this is how we get so much food on such small acreage. Right here I've got herbs, I've got my sweet potatoes, I've got all kinds of volunteers, and they seem to just be working harmoniously together. Right here I've got some tromboncino squash that's come up right in the middle of the sweet potatoes, and they're doing fine. I've got all kinds of babies coming on, plus all throughout here I've got all kinds of the tromboncino squash. And when we were working on the fence, which we're replacing, we were on the back side, and I noticed there's all kinds of tromboncinos on the back side that we'll be able to harvest. A tromboncino squash is an Italian squash, and you can either harvest it when it's young, like a summer squash, or let it mature and be a winter squash. So it's a great squash to be growing. This year I have a couple of late crops of onions that I need to get pulled up. Like these ones here. These are a red Long of Tropea. These are an heirloom onion, and they're usually later anyways. And I want to get these harvested before they start to regrow, because if they start to regrow, then they're not going to be good keepers. So as you can see that the tops have toppled over on them, so it's time to get them pulled up, and then they also kind of lay on their side. That's just their characteristics of them. But I'll get these harvested, I'll get them dried so that they can cure, so that I can store them properly for winter use. Every time I pull something out of the garden, I want to put something in its place. We want to keep our homestead highly productive. Whether you're homesteading or not, it's always a good idea to keep something in that garden area, whether it's a cover crop or something else. And September's a great time to be adding a cover crop. Cover crops are an inexpensive way to fix your soil with nitrogen and other nutrients. They grow quickly this time of year, come up, you chop them, work them back into the ground, and it really helps amend that soil. There's lots of cover crop choices, and they're really easy to plant. I like to just sprinkle them right over that area, no matter how big or small it is. Work it in with a little fork. You can throw some compost over the top of it, or you can just rake it in a little bit deeper. If you have a Luna like I do, you might have some bare spots like I do right here, and September is the perfect time to fix that. Did you do that, Luna? These little spots like this are really easy to fix. You'll just want to use a cultivating rake and just kind of rake up that surface. You can remove that old grass if you want to. Then you're going to just want to take some seed and just lightly sprinkle that in, rake that in, and then just put some manure right over the top of it to cover it. You want to make sure that you're using a composted steer manure that's weed free. It's not too hot, and that way you don't have weeds that get introduced into your lawn. September is the perfect time to be planting perennials. Perennials are slow to get going. The first year they're just developing their root system. So if we plant them in September, this allows them enough time to get a good root system before we have a hard freeze. The ones that I'm going to be planting is the Japanese anemone, also known as windflower. This is great for a shade garden. Along with it, I'm going to be planting some heucheras. These will stay their green color all through the winter time, as the Japanese will actually die back once we have a hard frost. So I'll just cut it back about 1 inch above the ground level, and then I'll mulch it. These are perfect for shade gardens. These are just a few tasks that I do in September, and I hope you find them helpful, and I'll see you next week.